welcome to today's episode of the Career Hacking Podcast. Our guest today is Jay. You may know him, ADHD therapist Jay from TikTok. So we're going to talk a bit more about neurodivergency in the workplace, specifically ADHD, and how you can manage that and how you can deal with that in your career. So do you want to just kick it off and maybe say a little bit about yourself first of all, and why your specialty is ADHD?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Justin. You can also call me Jay. I can go by either or, so it's totally fine. I'm a therapist and licensed clinical social worker over in the US, specifically in the Detroit area. And why I chose ADHD for my specialty, mainly for a variety of reasons. For those who watch my content either on Instagram or TikTok or whatever, they'll learn very quickly that I actually do have ADHD. So there's that personal component of it. But I also, as I started my career, I just happened to get a lot of people with ADHD in different roles that I've been in as clients. And so it just sort of became something that I realized not only I liked working with, but I also got the best results for those individuals I worked with compared to other areas I've worked in. So it just sort of worked out for me in time.
I think that's really cool to hear, especially that you've got that personal touch, you've got that personal connection, and I think that's what's really important. And it's probably going to come across more as we talk, because once you've got that personal connection, you've got that passion for it, you've got that enthusiasm, you'll go above and beyond. Not that you wouldn't with other things, but I think if it affects you personally, like if you know someone who has ADHD, which I think a lot of people will have come across someone with ADHD, or they'll know someone who's got it, they themselves might have it. I think it is personal to a lot of people, and it's important with neurodivergency, like in the workplace, that we kind of learn to, okay, this is something that's not going away. This is something that's been there for a while. It now has a voice, it has a label, and we can learn how to manage that effectively. And I think that's really important. So, with your clients then, when it's kind of, if you have someone who's got ADHD, do you treat them a bit differently to other people? Is their therapy slightly different? Is like the organisation different? What makes it, I don't want to use the word different again, but what makes it slightly different then for someone who has ADHD rather than someone who might have another neurodivergency or something?
So nowadays, pretty much my whole practice is ADHD. I would say under my own client load, I have about maybe 55 people. They all have come to me for some relatively reason for ADHD. Over the years, it's been about a 50-50 split, just being at agencies and things like that. I would probably say that a big thing with ADHD clients as opposed to other clients is you're going to be working a lot on timeliness. You're going to be working a lot on executive functioning. You're going to be working on attention and focus regulation skills, things like that. Whereas other people, it tends to be a little bit more trauma processing. And not to say that people with ADHD don't have trauma, because trust me, we do. But that's a whole other subsect of people. But when we're just treating the ADHD, it's more so life skill development. It's not necessarily super trauma based work. It's actually a lot of fun work. And that's a big reason why I really do enjoy it. And it gets really fun when you have somebody with trauma and ADHD too, because the symptoms can kind of overlap a little bit too.
Okay, so when you say about with executive functioning, can you expand a bit more about that? Because that sounds really interesting.
Yeah, so to just make this as easy as possible, executive functioning is essentially the life skills that we need every single day to essentially just operate, right? So there's 10 of them that I personally go over in my practice. So some of these skills are things like flexible thinking. This is our ability to, adjust our behavior to unexpected changes and be flexible and cope with changes and things of that nature. There's emotional control or emotional regulation. So that's being able to even out our emotions or bring them down, or if we see them getting to a high point, they're going to even out a little bit, right? There's task initiation, which is literally just starting the task. It's not necessarily finishing the task, but it's just literally trying to get something started. Then you have planning and prioritization, which also implies execution. So those are separate little things too. So planning is putting the steps in order and making sure that you can do steps 1 through 3 or 1 through 8 or whatever it is you're doing. And then prioritization is actually being able to execute on that plan and be able to kind of stick to things, right? Which also then goes into another executive functioning skill like attention and focus regulation. There's so many more we could go over too. So How I kind of look at executive functioning skills when people come in to see me for them, we'll go over these 10 skills. I'll actually have my clients rate these between 1 and 10. I like to see what their strengths are, what their areas of improvements are. And then I like to think of these skills as an integrated web. So I don't think of them as 10 separate skills. So if you're improving, let's say, flexible thinking, you're actively and you're taking active steps to improve that skill. You're probably also improving skills like emotional control. You're probably improving skills like attention and focus regulation, planning and prioritization, timekeeping, which is our ability to manage time, recognize time, understand that time is passing. You may also be improving a skill called self-monitoring. So this is kind of like self-awareness, but in the moment. It's not looking back like a couple days later being like, oh, I could have done this differently. It's how am I doing right now? So as you build on one skill, you're probably lifting other skills up without actively trying.
I really like that, and it's amazing that it's more life skills rather than it's just specifically for someone's career. Because time management is, I had a dentist appointment today as an example, and it's like it's important for everyday things, and it can be really difficult. So I can imagine as well, like with ADHD, it being more difficult, and that you're helping people by providing those skills, which people really do need. I think another question I have then, so with these executive like functions and things that people do need, I can understand why in a workplace it might be a struggle. So with workplaces, what do you think out of people that you've seen is kind of the most what do you say the most common issue people would face in a workplace? Like, is there one or two things that you see that's consistent where you're like, okay, this could be adapted to make it better?
Yeah, I think that some of the common challenges that I would see is definitely issues with task initiation. So actually just being able to get tasks started. And then in addition to that, you would also pair on a struggle with task avoidance. So there's very specific tasks that not only they're not getting started just because it's a task and I can't get this thing going, but we're actively avoiding certain things. And a lot of this often I find actually has to do with rejection, whether it's rejection from peers, rejection from their boss because maybe they're going to submit something that's not adequate, rejection to their own standards. So there's like a self-loathing of rejection, right? And I find a lot of this actually kind of relates back even in childhood when they were in school, because a lot of times they wouldn't turn in homework when they were a child, or something of that nature, because they didn't want to be judged for what they were turning in. So you'll find a lot of kids who are very smart with ADHD, but they don't turn their work in, or they there's another element of them forgetting to turn their work in too, but then there's also the element of them saying they forget to turn their work in and they actually didn't. They're just trying to hide it a lot of the time too. So there's a lot of those kind of habits would come from the childhood, and also that's formed based on their experiences too, because there are some teachers or some parents who will judge them, and that carries into adulthood, especially if you haven't treated ADHD as a child.
Okay, so with those habits then, how do you and this is kind of a question for everyone, especially people with ADHD, but if you've got those bad habits then that have been formed since you're a child, how do you go around breaking them? So like I've read Atomic Habits by James Clear is behind me. It's a really great book, and that does help, but it can be so difficult to change up those habits you've got, especially when it's ingrained in behaviour. So, how would you advise people? Like, what are a few tips you'd say, okay, if someone's got a very bad habit or a few that they want to break in this new year?
I think first they need to kind of look at themselves in a very strength based manner. If you have ADHD, you also need to look at yourself in a neurodiverse affirming manner. So, a strength based manner is looking more at your strengths than your areas of improvement. So, like I described earlier, if you're doing certain skills and you're honing in on one skill, you're lifting up other skills as is. So, what I'll actually do in my treatment, instead of focusing on the 3 or 4 bottom skills, I'll tend to focus a lot more on the 3 or 4 top skills that maybe somebody has in executive functioning, and I'll just kind of have them master those skills to ultimately lift a lot of those skills up. So if you start focusing on your strengths a lot more and are doing things that you're already kind of good at or kind of okay at, you're going to find is that you're going to carry those over naturally into other areas. But if you start at the bottom, a lot of people with ADHD just like to give up because it's a disorder of dopamine deficiency. So basically, what that means is if you don't have dopamine kind of producing through your body, you're not getting it naturally. It says you're not going to be motivated to do certain things. So if you're starting with something that you already are bad at or don't like, it's not going to be very well for you to start there, right? It's kind of like if you think of somebody who is in the gym, right? and maybe they're super into bodybuilding, why would suddenly their trainer just suddenly be like, well, now you're going to start training for a marathon? And so it's kind of the same concept in regards to working on what you're already good at versus what you're not. And the neurodiverse affirming approach, this is essentially just accepting yourself and your identity as an ADHDer. This is accepting that your brain is going to work different than other people. So their organizational structure that you see other people doing in the office, it's probably not going to apply to you. Or if it is, you need to put in some different system in place that tailors it to kind of some of your needs, and be okay with that. And then also be okay that you are going to forget things occasionally, and you are going to just not start something occasionally because it's just not going to be there, because that's not how your brain works, and your brain works in other different ways that actually add strengths to your job role. A lot of people with ADHD are super creative, for example. That's why I've managed to get 90,000 people on TikTok and 25,000 over on Instagram, right? So for me, it's something that I just focused in on with making content, rather than just deciding to keep doing well at these job roles that I was kind of performing mediocre at. So for context, as a social worker, I've done a lot of case management work. That involves a lot of paperwork. That involves a lot of logistics and things like that. I am not good with that kind of stuff. And I tried for the longest time to just make something work, and it just wasn't working. And so instead, I decided to go the therapist route, start my own private practice, do my own thing, form my own systems, and then just double down on my content because I saw I was good at it, and it worked for me.
I think you are marvelous. I love your content as well. But I think it's amazing that now you've kind of expanded it. So you're helping people by being you've become a therapist. Okay, you're helping people that way, but now you're helping people through content as well. So you're kind of expanding your reach as well. And I think that's amazing, and it's something really cool that you're doing. Especially with TikTok, because I think there has been a big rise in kind of probably searching of ADHD and people understanding what it is. Maybe some people misdiagnosing it, I want to say, through TikTok, just because the information is there, and a lot of people go, oh, I've got that, because they relate to a few of the traits. Do you think that that's really common? Is it that there is more people who have got ADHD and are realizing it, or maybe some people self-diagnosing or misdiagnosing because some of the traits they might have?
I think it's a big mix, right? Because I think there's a lot of people that are going online now, especially adults. So a lot of my client load, a lot of people they think of children and teens being struggling with ADHD. And actually, half of my own caseload is adults. And I love doing this because I love helping adults, and even in their 30s and 40s and 50s, really discover their ADHD diagnosis and figure out what that means to them and how it's affecting them today. But a lot of people with ADHD, their symptoms were ultimately ignored when they were a child. Whether it be, they just didn't notice it, or they didn't see it, or even all the way up to, ADHD isn't real, which is a stigma we're still trying to break. Thankfully, that's on, the down low, thankfully, finally. But, there are a lot of people who see videos like mine, and even see videos from other people, and they resonate with it, and so they want to see if something's getting checked out. And I think those are individuals who have a lot of validity, but I do also think that there are a lot of people who do go online, especially with how an app like TikTok and now Instagram is set up, where you're not necessarily searching for the content. It just kind of comes to you. And in time, the algorithm kind of comes forward to you. So it's a little bit different from even 10 years ago, where people would search things for themselves and start discovering their stuff on their own. Now it's like you have a whole entire app for people who you can just log in, see one video that just pops up right in front of your face unintentionally, and you could think you have this thing without context. So my important thing that I always say is, if you think you have something, you should always go get checked out by a professional before you start going to doctors and saying, I have this thing or whatnot. Because some doctors, they're supposed to do their due diligence, and some of them don't, unfortunately, right? So you get a lot of people who maybe are getting diagnosed with ADHD, and they may actually have something like bipolar disorder, because it can look a little bit the same. Now, in my work, I'm going on a little bit of a rant here, I know, but in my work, I have the opposite problem. I get a lot of women in my office who've been misdiagnosed bipolar when they actually were ADHD.
That's very interesting. I feel like that's, in my experience with people who've got ADHD and people who've got bipolar, it can appear quite differently. So why do you think then that a lot of women get maybe misdiagnosed?
I truly think it's really still because of sexism in our society. I think that a lot of women get a diagnosis that's related to hysteria. And then a reason for misdiagnosis in general outside of that is because with ADHD, looking on the outside in, You can look at excitability, which is something that we have. Is we have a lot of excessive excitability. We're fidgety. We're on the go. We are hyperactive. A lot of people could look at that as mania, and so a lot of women will get this if they also have an emotional outburst or if they have an emotional regulation issue, which that's part of ADHD too. Is you're going to have trouble regulating your emotions because we feel emotions pretty intensely. If you look at the reasons for ADHD and why our emotions are so intensely, there's always a reason associated with it. Whereas with bipolar, there's not necessarily a reason associated why they feel that way, right? So, for example, if you have something that let's say somebody forgot to show up for one of your podcast interviews, something like that may make you annoyed or frustrated or whatever. But someone with ADHD, they may feel very angry, more angry than maybe they should, or something like that, right? If you have something where you found $1 on the street or something and you're like, oh, cool, I'm gonna, yay, money, right? Someone with ADHD, we are going to be excited about that. We're going to feel that. So the intensity of the emotion doesn't necessarily add up, but it makes sense as to why they feel that category of emotion. Whereas someone with bipolar, they're going to wake up or just their mood is going to shift regardless of the situation or not.
Okay, that makes a bit more sense then. So it's kind of almost your experience is framing that reaction. So it's like, okay, yeah, if you experience, yeah, I get what you mean. So with bipolar, it's more it's a consistent thing of it's not necessarily going to be as affected by the day to day things that might happen. Okay, that's a really good, like, eloquent way to put it. I like the way you kind of articulated that, because I think it can be a bit of a difficult topic to talk about if there are people who have bipolar or ADHD, and maybe if they have been misdiagnosed, because it can be tricky and it can affect someone's life. So if someone who is maybe listening or watching this video, and they think, okay, maybe I have ADHD or maybe I have bipolar, how would you recommend someone first goes to getting diagnosed? So instead of just going straight to like a doctor, because that might be a bit intimidating, do you think there is value in maybe looking at certain TikTok accounts where you're like, okay, this is a few of the characteristics, or even just searching, like you said, searching on the web rather than an app? Do you think that can still be beneficial if someone has a curiosity or if they're a bit anxious if they have this?
I think it'd be beneficial, but I would say take it as a grain of salt until you actually seek a professional for it. So one of the YouTube channels that I personally recommend outside of my content is the How to ADHD YouTube channel. It's hosted by Jessica McCabe. She's a wonderful person who has ADHD. She's on TED Talks and things like that. I believe someone can correct me if I'm wrong later. I think she's in her 40s now, but she has talked about her struggles with having ADHD as an adult, and she makes a ton of videos every week on different aspects of ADHD, and things about ADHD and ways you can cope with it and things of that nature, right? So I would definitely recommend her. And she also uses different doctors and researchers and therapists and all sorts of people come on her channel either to do videos with her or to help collaborate with her to present the information and all that kind of stuff. So I definitely would recommend that channel as a good source for content. As far as outside of social media goes, depending on where you live, it depends on who you're going to go see, right? So in the U.S. and even in the U.S., it depends on which state you're in, right? So for the most part, though, you can go seek a therapist. So this would be a licensed clinical social worker. This would be a licensed professional counselor. This would be a licensed marriage and family therapist. People like that you can go check out and see, and they could probably get you a diagnosis of ADHD. Now, you do want to be careful when you go do this. So if you're looking at something like Psychology Today, I'm not sure what the UK has for a directory online. I don't know if it's Psychology Today or not, but for us, that's what we have mainly, and then a few others. What you want to look for with ADHD is you want to see somebody's written bio, and you want to see how much do they talk about the ADHD experience, or how much do they mention ADHD. Because a lot of these bios, what they'll do is there's a lot of therapists, they'll check off every diagnostic criteria under the box, and they'll just check off ADHD, anxiety, depression, borderline personality, bipolar, all these things, and they're not actually an expert in it. They just kind of know it. So if somebody comes along, they just know ADHD on a generalist level. You're going to really want to work with somebody who knows ADHD in order to figure out, do you want to get the diagnosis for ADHD? Now, another option that you could do, and this is a little bit longer of a process, you could also go get a psych test, a psychological test. And so this is going to be administered by a doctorate level psychologist. So it's a lot longer than evaluations that you would see from a therapist. They are a lot more money depending on where you're at, but sometimes insurance does cover it. But they are something that's going to be a little bit more accurate than a basic assessment and evaluation. And then the other option that you could find, this is more of a new thing, is it's kind of like an even middle of the road. There's a lot of clinics now that do what's called QB testing. So they're about the same length of a traditional therapy appointment, 1 to 2 hours or so. They hook you up to a laptop. They kind of check your movements. You do different exercises, and they also account for your history, just like we would do in an evaluation. And you can also get diagnosed with ADHD that way. So with all three of these methods, however you do it, between a therapist, a psych doc, or what's it called, a psychologist, or doing this QB test style, the results are about anywhere between 80 to 95% accurate between all three of them.
Okay, that's good though. I suppose if it's quite high then with the accuracy on those tests, and I suppose that's what you want, especially if someone thinks, okay, maybe they have ADHD, and it'll put their mind at ease because then they're like, okay, yeah, I've got it, or maybe they might have something else that's along the same vein, and then I suppose they can work to manage in it. When it comes to careers, then, so I know that like I've done a behavioural analysis, I've done personality type tests and things before, and they've been really interesting. And they've shown okay, kind of some of the careers that maybe I'd be best suited for, and the results were very interesting because I used to be very introverted and now I'm a lot more extroverted. So it kind of was a bit of a split. So with things like that, where you've got a personality test and it would say, okay, here's maybe some of the careers that would blend well with your personality and suit your lifestyle. Do you have any recommendations? I know it's quite a broad question, but do you have any recommendations then for someone who maybe has ADHD and like you said, they're very creative people, so the type of career that they'd be best suited to go into or the type of industry?
So it really does depend on the person, but I would say that a lot of places where people with ADHD do thrive, they do thrive on stuff where typically they can do, they have the same job role, the same thing that they do every day, but there's always like a new project you're kind of working on, if that makes sense. So if you're looking into careers like maybe in the medical field, you may want to look into something that works at a hospital in the emergency room, because you'd have the precautions you do every day. You understand the routines of the day, but also anything could come in at any moment, and you got to get creative with what you do, because the idea of an emergency room is you're not necessarily trying to heal someone. You're not trying to make them thrive. It kind of sounds morbid thinking of it this way. You're just trying to prevent them from not dying, right? So it kind of allows us to have something where we get to have a job where we don't actively think and we just do. Some other things that we could probably do well in, if you're a super creative person, you could probably work in marketing. You could do presentations all day. You could be a social media manager. And those would work really good because those are jobs where you're getting constant praise. And that's something that we need as ADHDers, is we really love praise. We tend to love praise, I guess I should say. And it gives us little hits of dopamine throughout the day. So if you're making content for a small business or even a big brand or something like that, you're probably going to get likes and comments and feedback from just people watching the content, for example. As you can see, this is why I like doing content, right? Because you get a lot of good feedback, and then occasionally not so nice content, but feedback, but that's a whole other thing. But yeah, like you're getting a lot of feedback throughout the day, and you're getting really good positive praises on things, or they say that your content's funny or relatable or whatever business you're running. And it just makes you feel good. And so it makes you incentivized to keep making content and keep doing your thing while you're at work. But yeah, anything where you can just think on your feet and be creative, I would say to kind of go out into those avenues and just explore it further.
Yeah, that does make sense. And I liked when you said about how, especially with social media and like content creation, you're getting that feedback and that you're almost getting those affirmations throughout the day that it's like, yeah, I'm doing a good job. And that seems like it'd be really, really helpful. Especially if you've got all those worries in the back of your mind, like, am I doing things on time? Am I doing this right? Because maybe you're like, oh, like you said, in the past, you hadn't done it right when you were at school. And now with project management, you're like, am I doing it right? So it's probably great to have all that feedback then throughout the day consistently. If there is someone who's listening and they have ADHD and they're maybe in a job that isn't creative, it's not going to give them those dopamine hits, it doesn't have a lot of feedback throughout the day, maybe more like I don't know, of an office job, something like that, or something a bit different where it's probably not super stimulating, how would you recommend that they could make that job a bit more ADHD friendly? Like even if it's like, would you say like fidget toys, something like that throughout the day?
Yeah, so depending on the level of how unstimulating and how much you really do dislike the job, right? It really depends, right? So if you're somebody who, you like the people around you, you like doing the role, but you're like having trouble sitting still and just being there, right? You could have fidget toys, they have fidget rings that just go right on your finger and you can just do it kind of slyly and spin it around or something like that. There's fidget cubes that are like super small, and they have like different buttons on them that they can press. There's fidget pens that you can actually work and click around with while you work, right? So there's a lot of different devices that you could do. Other something else I would say is that if you're working at an office job, if you're working at like a desk job at the computer, something like that, I would probably find ways to go on mini breaks throughout the day. So I would say like this is where you go get more water, or if you go to the bathroom or something like that. But make something kind of like a quest and just make it kind of frequently. I actually am thinking back how I learned this too. I learned this in college when I was writing papers, where every 20 minutes I'd actually have to get up out of my seat, and sometimes even more than that actually. But I'd have to get out of my seat and I'd have to leave my computer and I'd actually have to walk around the school for 2 minutes and then I would come back and I would just pump out more stuff and I'd walk around the school for 2 more minutes and then I'd just put more stuff in. And so it's if you can get movement into your day somehow, that would be really helpful. But if you're somebody who also just doesn't like your job and you're somebody who has people around you that just are not stimulating to you and maybe even just downright rude or mean or whatever, there's nothing you're going to input into your life that's going to make that situation better. Maybe it's going to be bearable or you can cope with it better by doing some of these things and taking your own power into your hands. But a lot of people with ADHD frequently actually quit jobs. Usually people with ADHD last at jobs anywhere between like 1 to 2 years on average. And then they kind of just exit and leave and go to their next thing. If you're in that kind of situation, I wouldn't feel shame from that because first of all, you have like way more skills than probably anybody else ever has versus staying at one job for years on end, right? So that's how I actually learned how to build my practice and learn social media and do all these things, right? Because I had a new job every single year until I started my practice, which I feel like a little bit embarrassed to admit, but I worked for the court systems. I've worked for secure residential places, which is just a big fancy word for mental health juvenile detention, essentially. I worked for a telehealth company before we also all switched to telehealth and virtual because of COVID and all that kind of stuff. So I worked there for a little bit and I learned how to market because of them and present because of that job and things of that nature, right? And then I learned how to do different things for people who had autism at another job I went to. And then I learned different assessment tools that were more advanced than other jobs I've had at the next job I had before I started all this, right? So for you, if you're someone who needs to constantly leave jobs, don't feel bad because you're going to obtain more information. It's going to make you more valuable. Statistically, you're probably going to make a lot more money too, actually. And then on top of that, the world just is not made for people with ADHD. So at the end of the day, if you need to bounce and leave, that I think that's totally fine.
I really agree. I'm someone who I constantly change around jobs. That makes it sound really bad, but like it's usually after a year, or it's going to be at the moment I've been at my current job like a year and a half, nearly 2 years, but I do still like it because it does change up quite a lot, and I have a lot of job rotation. But I do think it. I talked about this on one of my other episodes. It's a more common thing now. I think it's getting more accepted that it's okay to keep moving around jobs, learn different skills if you don't know what it is that you want to do. So anyone who's listening and he's like, oh my goodness, I'm in that boat, and you're switching jobs like quite frequently, don't stress about it. It's fine, and I guarantee you'll get way more skills from doing that. So yeah, I think it's just a lot more common with today's society. But do you think that we're moving towards as a culture, like as a working culture, even just as the US, if you can comment on that, is do you think we're working towards something that's more like welcoming, that's more what do you say, inclusive as a culture of neurodivergencies or people with ADHD? And like I know you said you've worked with people with autism before. Is that becoming something that's more kind of normalized now rather than oh it's a stereotype or it's a stigma around it?
I would say with ADHD, I think there's still a lot of stigma to it. I mean, I think that we've done a lot better work than the 2000s and 2010s. So I think in this era, I think we are improving quite a bit. But I think there's still a lot more work to be done. I think if anything, just from experience I've seen, I've noticed that people want to hire somebody, like if they're going to choose between the two, right? There's still discrimination with autism, of course, but they will likely want to choose somebody with autism more than somebody with ADHD. And this is going to sound really bad, but this is actually a stigma that a lot of autistic people have. I'm saying this as somebody, I'm actually in the process right now of getting diagnosed with autism myself, just for everybody's clear too, because that's a very common thing with ADHD. Um, but a lot of people think that autistic people are cute and they think like they're childish. And so they'd rather have a cute, childish person, even though a lot of them are very much adult like and very intelligent. But that's the stereotype they have. So they'd rather have someone like that in an office space because they're cute and they're fun and they're whatever. ADHD, it almost has a bad rap still, and it's almost like we're the individuals who can't focus, can't sit still. And there's also a defiance factor in there too, or oppositional defiance, where that's ODD, which is a whole separate diagnosis. But a lot of people associated that with ADHD because a lot of kids who get diagnosed with ADHD, especially through the juvenile justice system too, if you've had people like that, a lot of times ODD gets just slapped on to ADHD. So there's a big systemic thing that we need to just work on just in general when it comes to our diagnostic practices, because it bleeds into our day-to-day within the workflows, right? And that fuels stigma and misunderstanding and all these type of things. But I do think it is getting better to an extent. I wish it was a lot more further along.
Mm. I agree with that. I think that, especially in the UK, maybe I can't comment on like a comparison with America. It does seem like it's getting a lot more inclusive, in a lot of workplaces and things. And I noticed that a lot more people. This might be the company I work for. They're amazing, but I think a lot more people are more outspoken about various different parts of their life. Like if they're part of LGBTQ, if they're part of like an ethnic minority, anything like that, it's more outspoken. I think that's amazing. But I think it is great with, for example, ADHD, because that's the one we're talking about, and autism, things like that. That it's people can feel comfortable to talk about it and identify with that, and it's something I've noticed, at least in a lot of workplaces I've been in, and my university that I went to. It's something where instead of when I was at school, it wasn't talked about, like it just wasn't talked about, and then now at university, we'd ask people and be curious, and it's like, but not a bad curiosity. It's like, oh right, tell me about that. It's people are interested to hear their story or how things are different for them. It's not anything really that bad. So I think it is definitely heading in the right direction. Um, so do you think that, I know you said it's still difficult because you've got the stigma of like ADHD, that sometimes you can be quite defiant. Do you think that comes from maybe like a stereotype of that, if there's that kid in class that can't sit still, that they're the one that might like shout at the teacher? Do you think that's where like those stereotypes come from? It's like from kids that have ADHD, or do you think it's adults who are saying, okay, right, I don't agree with this, and they can be quite outspoken? Where do you think that comes from, that stereotype?
I think it starts from adults, especially teachers, just because they work with kids pretty much all day, every day, right? But I think it comes from how they interact with individuals with ADHD, and not even just kids with ADHD, but I mean just kids in general who are shouting or hyper or whatever. Often, what you'll find with these teachers is it's kind of hard not to, right? So I'm giving this credit where credit is due, but you end up forming personal relationships with those students just because you see them day in and day out. So you have a biased lens just by being a teacher working with someone every day, right? So in order to be a professional at like kind of what you do when you work with individuals, something I always say is that we have to work on eliminating those biases, even if we have them within our internal. We have to make sure we're presenting externally out to make sure we eliminate them as much as we can, right? So if you already have an internal bias that you're not working on, then externally you're going to call that kid a bad kid in front of other kids. So then all the other kids think the ADHD kid is always bad, right? Some things that are pretty common in schools, unfortunately, are, and you're not even supposed to talk about this in schools, which is a whole other, this is a whole other subtopic that I could go on for days about, actually. But like sometimes school administration, staff, teachers, stuff like that. And I don't mean to frame them in like horrible ways, but this is what it is, what a lot of people with ADHD have been facing. They'll talk about their diagnosis in class, right? They'll use the words like, get your ADHD under control or something like that, right? Because of IEP plans or personal plans that they do for accommodations or things of that nature, right? Because they have that personal relationship with that child. So they know enough about them, they know it, and it just kind of comes out. But what that kind of happens over time is that skews that child between his peers as well as just other grades or other classes he may be going to or going to be in, right? you're going to see those comments from that other teacher and hear about this kid, or you're going to see this report that they wrote, and you're not going to treat that kid with a blank space. And so a lot of kids who were acting up in first, second, third grade, they've been a labeled child all the way into high school.
So I can imagine that has a bit of an impact as well. Like if they've got that label from such an early age and then that kind of follows them, it's not going to help. It's definitely not going to help. I think it'll probably be the opposite. It's going to be a hindrance. So with teachers then, what do you think, I feel like we're putting the world to rights here with this conversation, but what do you think is something that teachers can do to be a bit more inclusive? Yeah, it might be a difficult job, and especially if you've got children that are being, I don't know, that maybe not following what they're asking them to do, or they are being a bit hyper and they're not sure how to act. What do you think's maybe some advice you'd give to teachers on how to deal with children that may have ADHD and they might need a bit of extra care?
So for personal self-care for themselves, I think that they need to be able to take breaks and not have to speak in that moment, because unless that child is about to hurt somebody or about to, break something that could potentially hurt themselves and with that, there's not a lot of things that has to be done right there in that moment if you've already tried redirecting. So you can take a break, you can let him just scream for 1 or 2 or 3 minutes and just decide what are you going to do, right? It's a little different if he's going to hurt someone, so you need to act and do what you can, do that kind of stuff, right? We want to make sure everyone's safe. But, take a couple minutes. Your lesson plan is not going to be deterred by this 3 to 5 minute that you just do to let him calm himself or try to talk with him and then decide what you're going to do, right? But I think more importantly, there's two things we can do. So there's one thing the teachers can do, and there's also another thing that the school itself can do. The teachers can start with by talking with the school social worker, because they're usually the ones that are going to be most trained in the school to understand about ADHD. You could also talk to your special education director that's in the school too. Those two would probably be the best resources for you to give guidance either for that individual child or just for yourself handling ADHD kids in general. The other thing that schools can do is they can actually offer training to the general population. I think it just it flashed a message on me, said we're disconnected. Are we good?
No, we're all good.
Okay,
Yeah,
good.
don't worry about it.
Perfect. Okay. So the other thing that the schools can do is they can actually offer trainings to the general population teachers on ADHD, because there's a lot of kids with ADHD, whether they're formally diagnosed, they're not diagnosed, that aren't in special education because they don't qualify for it, right? So a lot of them don't have 504 plans yet, or whatever plan it's called in whatever country anybody's in, right? But like they don't have 504 plans, they don't have IEP plans, they don't have anything on paper saying that they need this help. And so a lot of things that you can do is by doing that training and getting trained and having your teachers trained in this area is they can spot signs and symptoms of ADHD and not necessarily make that a diagnosis, right? Because that should be done by somebody else. But if they think it and they want to try to just put informal accommodations into their class without having something formalized, and they can handle that, right? Then they should be able to do that and be able to have that power within their own classroom. And that also strengthens the relationship that you have with that teacher too, which is a big thing with kids with ADHD. You need to have a strong relationship with them sometimes, just for the purposes of them not feeling rejected.
And I think that feeds into as well what you said before, is that when we're talking about the careers, that with people with ADHD, they kind of, that feedback's really important, the affirmations, things like that. So you will still need that from an early age, and it's important, I suppose, that teachers still provide that. But it's really interesting to hear that, yeah, from an early age, the experiences you have, it can really frame your, like, it creates your frame of reference for when you're older, and it can impact you. Um, do you see a lot of adults that get diagnosed with ADHD, or do you come across more people who have been diagnosed as a child or as an adult?
Do I personally? So now that I do the work that I do, I see a lot more adults coming in to get help, but that's just because my main niche is with adults. I do see kids and teens and pretty much all across the spectrum, but my main thing with my marketing is I really love helping adults discover their ADHD diagnosis. But before that, it was children. So usually what we're trying to do is we're trying to, especially nowadays too, because there's a lot of things that we're more aware of, right? So a lot of parents are actually more open to mental health as opposed to us in the 90s and 2000s, where ADHD was looked at as this big, terrible thing, even by parents, or it wasn't real, or had this big stigma against it, right? So a lot of parents are more open to the idea that mental health problems could be something that just needs to be addressed, and they don't look at it as like this big, severe, hidden secret thing. Um, but yeah, we do get that a lot. Whenever I get an assessment call, 9 times out of 10, it's usually for a child. Usually with an adult, they're not looking to get diagnosed. They actually just want to go full blown into therapy, and they just want to like discover this. Which I always say too with therapy, by the way, just as a side note. If you're looking to get diagnosed, a good way to start is just by going to therapy and exploring yourself as a whole, right? And it's actually the best way to get diagnosed too, as opposed to even just psych testing or just getting an assessment, because you actually get a long-term history that way too.
Well, that's a really interesting thing to say because I suppose if you're in therapy and you're talking things out, then your therapist could also maybe connect some of the dots with the behaviours and say, okay, maybe this might be a diagnosis possibly, and then you can explore that option as well. I think it is interesting as well that like it, when I was younger, it was kind of kids that got diagnosed with ADHD, but now it's also opened up to if you're an adult, you can still get a diagnosis and it's a lot easier. And then people who I know that are neurodivergent is once they've got that diagnosis later in life, they look back and everything makes sense. Do you find that that's quite a common feeling when almost freeing when someone has got that diagnosis and they look back and they're like, wait, all this makes sense to those behaviors?
I find it does because it gives a nice clean term for the most part, right? So it gives you the idea of like, oh, I'm not just disorganized and I'm not just forgetful and I can't just not start anything. Like I actually have this thing that makes these things more challenging. And so it's almost like this feeling of somebody knows what I'm going through and it also has a name. And so there's a lot of comfort as a result of that.
Yeah, do you think that almost provides like a community for people then? Because if you say, okay, you've got this behavioral pattern, you realize when you're older, okay, this is ADHD. Do you feel like people can have a community and they feel unified in a way? They've got that, okay, I know what other people are going through. They know what I'm going through. Does that really help people then to have that label?
I think it does. I think it helps them create a community, and it even helps them even find friends and lifelong confidants and things like that too, right? And I think it's really funny too. I was actually just discussing this with somebody last week. But ADHD, as well as autism, I would say too, they're two of the only disorders that you will find in the DSM that you will have like a sense of community and pride to have. So you'll never see this with like major depressive disorder. You won't probably see this with generalized anxiety disorder or things of that nature, right? But I think that the reason that the ADHD and the autism communities and the neurodivergent communities, they just connect so well with the label, I think it's just because like it's more or less integrated into the brain. It's more actually shown within the brain that this isn't just like a thing that we struggle with. Like this is actually part of our identity, and that's been proven through research and brain scans and things like that. You can actually take a look at somebody's ADHD brain, and you can see mass differences with the structure and the brain waves, and however they do stuff way beyond my pay grade, just so we're clear. But they've looked at all of this, and you can see physical differences, even just with how the brain lights up and electrifies with different situations compared to neurotypical people.
That's insane. I bet that's like something really beautiful to look at and see on a brain scan that it looks different. Like that is I need to research that more. That is absolutely fascinating.
I think they're moving toward doing that more often too. So a lot of this research, it's like been done over the last like 10, 15 years or so. So I think eventually what we'll have is we will have it set up probably to where eventually you could see if someone has ADHD or autism just literally at birth. And you could see the differences in the brain that way eventually. I don't know when that'll be exactly, but they can detect autism right now. I think it's as early as 2, and then ADHD is about 5 or 6. You can start actually diagnosing that with formalized assessments and things of that nature. So eventually, I have a feeling we're going to have a more scientific route that's going to even advance assessment and diagnostic stuff.
Oh, that's amazing to hear, because then I suppose people will be able to know from an earlier age. Do you think that there is any detriment then to people who are diagnosed later on, as opposed to someone who's been diagnosed younger and has had more time to kind of manage it and have it form part of their identity and grow up with that?
I think there is some level to it to having it done later, but I will also say this: a lot of people also will take that and say it's too late for me to get diagnosed. And I always say that the best time to get diagnosed or treated for ADHD was 10 years ago, but the second best time is today. So I would say that if you are an adult in your 30s or 40s or 50s, you can still manage a ton of your life and live a very active, happy life by managing this today, right? So it may cause some more challenges in life just because you're kind of starting where other people would traditionally start at age 6 or age 10 or whatever. But it's not necessarily something that's going to be impossible for you to go through, too.
Hmm. That makes sense, and I like that phrase. It's probably better to get diagnosed 10 years ago, but the second best time is today. Because if someone has a diagnosis, it's still a part of them, even if they've got it later on. Um, how do you think then with ADHD, how does it interact with possible like other mental disorders, things like that? So, for example, if you have ADHD, could you also have anxiety? Can you also get like a major depressive disorder? Could you also have bipolar? Because I know you were saying before that some women get like it could be one or the other misdiagnosed, but could you actually have both? Could you have a few different ones?
Okay, this is one of my favorite questions because it gets really messy and murky, right? So, but the short answer is yes, you absolutely can. So the issue is that we like to see with bipolar disorder how often are you, first of all, is there a frequency? That's the big thing that they look for. I'm not a bipolar specialist, but I know enough of it to see if there's like warning signs that warrant a referral for further assessment. So one of the things that they would look at is the frequency of them, right? Whereas with ADHD, it's more situational. And so what's funny is you can actually have situational mood shifts as well as frequent mood swings, right? So you might see something happen every, let's say, 2 or 3 months or something with somebody with bipolar disorder. They'll switch from a depressive mode to a manic mode or what have you, right? And then maybe they'll switch back to a more euthymic node, which is like a baseline, right, every 2 to 3 months or so. But there's usually pretty predictable patterns when it comes to people with bipolar disorder. And so what we'll find is with people who have ADHD and bipolar, you'll see those patterns. You'll see the mood shifts just all of a sudden come about, but then you'll see other mood shifts with actions too. So you'll see them in different ways, but then sometimes if, like, let's say they're in a depressive episode, for example, you'll see them present with different emotions when they're in a depressive episode, but they'll present differently still, if that makes sense, right? So you can still have these things. You can still have depression. You can still have anxiety. In fact, depression and anxiety are actually very common co-occurring disorders with ADHD. But you can have a multitude of these. I would say that it's a lot rarer, but it does happen, right? It does happen. So if you do think that you have both or you've been diagnosed with one, I always say it never hurts getting a second opinion. It never hurts getting some other things checked out. And I say that even for myself as someone who diagnoses ADHD, if you don't sit with that label well for whatever reason, you can always go get a second opinion, see what's going on. And, I would always encourage that for anybody.
I think that's really important as well. Is that the fact that you're saying if someone doesn't feel comfortable with that label, if someone's unsure, then they can always go to someone else. And I suppose that would then kind of that second opinion would provide a bit more of a okay, yeah, I do have this, and then almost solidify that with them. Because do you find that some people, if they get diagnosed with ADHD, they kind of almost reject it, and especially if they maybe have a bit more of a, I'd say more like old school traditional mentality, if they get diagnosed with ADHD, could they then reject it and say, no, no, I don't have that?
I think it's rejected more so among older adults, but also, again, just because I am a specialist, I get a lot of people who are like, they kind of start at the I think I have this. So because of how my practice is set up, a lot of people come to me and it's like now it's I think I have this. I really want to know about it. And so those people tend to be excited. But when I worked in more generalist practices and I would have to introduce for the first time, like, so you're showing symptoms of this. Have you ever thought about this? Like there is a little bit of hesitancy or worry or and then sometimes curiosity too. But there is a little bit of hesitancy to kind of take it on at first, just because that label of ADHD has always been labeled as so extreme. Often it's also associated with stimulant medication. Stimulant medication is typically the go-to prescription for ADHD medication, and I think people think of just weird things about psych meds as a whole, but let alone stimulant medication, right? And I always tell people this too, and a lot of people in the ADHD don't really like when I say this, just because a lot of them are very pro medication. I consider myself medication neutral. As a therapist, I don't think you have to go get medication right this second. I don't think, unless you're going to hurt yourself or hurt somebody else, there is this emergency for you to go get it, right? So if you want to explore your ADHD diagnosis without medication, that's totally fine as your therapist. I might say, cool, yeah, let's just work on some skills. Let's work on processing things. Let's get some things in order. And then about 3 or 4 or 5 months later, we'll be working together. And some people, they do great. And other people, they realize they haven't made progress, or they haven't made enough progress like they thought they would. And that's when we maybe talk about getting a medication evaluation from a doctor again. But I let them come to their own terms on it, rather than force it down them and be like, you have to go do this thing or you're not gonna whatever. I just don't find it helpful.
Mm-hmm. That's so important as well. I think that you're giving people the freedom that once they've got a diagnosis for something, that it's kind of their progress, it's in their hands, that, if they need to get medication or if they want to, they can do, but you're not going to be like, okay, here, take this. It's just a recommendation. I think that's really important, because I know, like, in the UK here, the NHS is amazing, and I'm very glad that we do have that health service. But there is a bit of a stigma with mental health and things, that sometimes they will just kind of give you a prescription. And that is sometimes their first port of call, which isn't the best thing. But with ADHD then, what kind of medication can people take? Like, what kind of things do help with ADHD?
Mm-hmm. So there's 2 types of major medications. So there's stimulant medication, there's non-stimulant medication. So the most common stimulant medication would be Adderall. And so this is usually one of the first things people go to. Another one that somebody might take for ADHD is going to be Vyvanse. This one is often prescribed for individuals who are struggling with overeating or binge eating disorder, that's accompanied with ADHD as well. And then there's some other ones that are off-label non-stimulant medications. I always say, to get medication-specific information, make sure you go talk to your doctors about it. But stimulant medication is statistically the best for people with ADHD. Now, I kind of take statistics with a grain of salt. The only reason I say this, as someone who's a person-centered therapist, I work with the idea that everybody's different. So there are people who take medications, or they take stimulant medications for ADHD, and it causes a lot of adverse side effects, much like many medications will do, right? So there are individuals who will take stimulants, and for most of them, it works out great, works out fine, we're good to go, ready to go, right? For some people, they may get nightmares. They may get rashes. They may have night sweats. Just to name a few side effects. There's plenty more. Someone could go through with those as well too, right? I've had one person who, when they would take stimulants for whatever reasoning, they would just get sick and they would get nauseous and they would get lightheaded. And, as a therapist, I want you to live your best life and live your most thriving life possible. And that's not going to happen if you're nauseous and sick all the time, right? So I'm not going to force you to take it for the purposes of, well, now you can clean a house. You know what I mean? It just doesn't make any sense to me. So that's usually when maybe some non-stimulant routes might help too, just because one of the most popular non-stimulants is Wellbutrin. So that one is also, I believe it's an anxiety and depression medicine as well, if I remember correctly. But that one will often help with hyperactiveness, fidgetiness, things like that. The only thing with non-stimulants is they take longer to produce. So stimulants kind of speed up your brain a little bit. They speed things along. So you see instant results a lot faster. Non-stimulants, it's going to take probably at least a couple of weeks before you'll start seeing any changes.
So, how often, whether it's going to be with medication, or whether it's just, with therapy making changes to behaviour, how often do you find that people see progress? Like, is it going to be very quick, or does it depend on the person, or will it be very slow, like changing the habits, breaking down those behaviours and understanding what's causing them? Once someone's got a diagnosis, how long do you think it'll take before they see change, really?
You said once they get a diagnosis, or once they start taking medication, will they see change?
Okay, so if we say, like, once they get a diagnosis, and then I suppose if medication's involved in that, then once they've been diagnosed, then.
Got you. Okay, so what I say is this: diagnosis. If you were just to get diagnosis alone and then kind of go out the door and say bye with it, to me, that's just only information, and that's giving that you accept the diagnosis too, right? So for some people, a diagnosis can be actually very helpful in terms of mood management, self-esteem, things like that, and that's great. We love that. But it's probably not going to help your day to day as much, right? So if you're looking for more day to day help, therapy, medication, or I guess I should say, and or medication, right? That's going to be kind of some of your best bets to actually see more progressive life changes outside of the way you see yourself and your self-esteem. And even with self-esteem building, there's a whole element of self-esteem building that we do in therapy with people for ADHD, right? So even when you go to therapy, just getting that diagnosis isn't just going to boost it, but it's going to make it feel a little bit better. I would say if you start therapy, right, it depends on the therapist, the relationship you have. I would probably say you'll see changes in about 3 to 6 months, probably. And then medication, if you have giving it, this depends also if you have the right medication, if the medication's working for you, you're not having adverse side effects. You'll probably see changes from that with mood and just day to day living, probably in about 1 to 2 months. So you combine both of those with therapy, giving both are working great, you're going to get really great results.
I think that's a lot quicker than most people would think as well, because like I said, even with just the therapy alone, it could be like 3 to 6 months. That's still quite quick, especially if it's something that you've dealt with for such a long time. So I think that's really interesting to see, and obviously if that's coupled with the medication and that works great and all of it goes amazing, then that'll be even quicker to see changes. Um, but I think it's amazing to hear like the work that you're doing to helping people with ADHD and providing all this wonderful information. And also, like, thank you so much for your time today. This has been amazing. I feel like I've learned so much, and anyone who's listening is going to learn so much about ADHD, and also like how it's common, it's fine, it's not something to be scared of. It's something where, yeah, it just makes you an amazing person, and then you'll have other like amazing characteristics, like you'll be more creative, things like that, very high energy. So everything's fine, everything's cool, and it's great that you can almost mold your career to work for you, whether that's the type or the kind of things that you need to look out for when you're choosing a career. So that's been amazing. And I really appreciate your time on the podcast today. It's been amazing to chat with you. Is there anything else that you'd like to add before we wrap up?
Yeah, I'll just add just two things here real quick. So the first is also just going back into our conversation a second ago. Just keep in mind it also does depend for your result. It depends on how knowledgeable your doctor and your therapist is on ADHD, because there's a lot of people who end up getting with generalists. And there are some generalists who are really great, but I always say for ADHD, I would obviously always just recommend someone who specializes it or at least knows it very well enough to where you're going to see those results. Because a lot of times what's going to happen is you're going to get someone who's just heard of ADHD once or twice here and there, and then they're going to tell you to organize your life to go use a planner. Like, we don't have 12 planners sitting in our house just somewhere for the last 12 years. You know what I mean? So you're going to find you want to find someone who really understands the ADHD brand, is really going to work with you personally. The other thing I want to leave off with too is that a lot of people come to therapy and they actually want to figure out, how to quote cure their ADHD. So first and foremost, ADHD is a neurodevelopmental disorder, which means you're not getting rid of this. It's just ingrained within your brain. It's here to stay. You manage it, you treat it, but you don't cure it, right? The other thing, though, I just want to add with that is, like, a lot of people, when they look at their ADHD, they feel conflicted on how they feel about it. I will just sit here and say it. I'm almost 30 years old. I turned 30 in about 2 months. I love having ADHD. And I know some people look at me and they think that's really weird to just say, because it's like, why wouldn't you just want to, like, be kind of like everybody else and be able to just, integrate into that, and it would make your life so much easier. And it really would. But I've honestly just learned how to appreciate my ADHD traits. And I've learned how to just really embrace what I have and what ADHD has made me, because I wouldn't have the opportunities I have right now without my ADHD. I would probably be somewhere like pushing paper somewhere and, living, an adequate but boring life, right? I get to have so many opportunities and speak to so many people and go on podcasts and get speaking gigs and make content because of my ADHD. So I've just learned to really love it and embrace it and double down on my ADHD traits. And it's brought me the most success the last 5 years.
Oh, it's amazing to hear, and I love the fact that you're so passionate about your journey and that you're saying, "Oh, I don't want that boring life. I want this excitement." And I think that's definitely what you've got, and you're bringing it to other people through your content and through doing podcasts like this. But yeah, that's amazing, and thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it, and it's been such an interesting conversation. I'll provide all the links down below or kind of like in the comments and things so that anyone can find you and they can see your wonderful content. But yeah, thanks for listening or watching if you're on YouTube. And I hope everyone has a wonderful day. So don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, follow, just interact with the content if you're enjoying it, and let me know what else you'd like to see. Thank you.